The storm brews. The bell rang, slicing through the chatter of students milling about in the hallways of Westfield High School. It marked the beginning of another day. But for Jasmine King, it felt different. As she stepped into her English classroom, the usual sounds of laughter and camaraderie faded away, replaced by an almost palpable tension that clung to the air like a heavy fog. Miss Roberts, the teacher, stood at the front of the room, her stern gaze sweeping over the students as they settled into their seats. Jasmine felt the weight of that gaze as it landed on her, the newcomer, and she held her breath for a moment, bracing herself for whatever might come. Well, look who we have here," Miss Roberts began, her voice dripped with a false sweetness that made Jasmine's skin crawl. "A new addition to our class. I do hope you can keep up with our rigorous curriculum." The way she emphasized rigorous made it clear she doubted Jasmine's ability. The other students, a mixture of curiosity and wariness, watched as Jasmine made her way to an empty desk, feeling their eyes boring into her. She swallowed hard but met Miss Roberts's gaze with a steady look of her own. As the lesson began, Jasmine tried to focus on the discussion of To Kill a Mockingbird, a novel she had studied extensively in her previous school. Miss Roberts started to outline the themes of power and oppression, but Jasmine's excitement quickly dimmed as she sensed the teacher's dismissive attitude toward her. "Who would like to start?" Miss Roberts asked, glancing around the room while deliberately ignoring Jasmine's raised hand. A ripple of tension moved through the classroom, the atmosphere thickening as Miss Roberts continued to sidestep Jasmine's attempts to participate. Jasmine's frustration began to simmer. With every student called upon, she felt herself becoming more invisible, as if her voice did not matter in this space. When Miss Roberts finally acknowledged her, it was with a tight smile that felt more like a sneer. "Yes, Miss King. Do you have something to contribute?" Jasmine straightened her back, her heart racing as she spoke. "I believe the novel shows how systemic racism influences the characters' lives and decisions." Before she could elaborate, Miss Roberts cut her off, waving her hand dismissively. "My dear, I think you're confusing this classic American novel with some modern political agenda." The murmurs that rippled through the classroom were a mix of surprise and discomfort. Jasmine's jaw clenched, but she remained silent, her fingers curling tightly around the edge of her desk. Miss Roberts returned to her lesson, ignoring Jasmine as she continued to speak. The message was clear. Jasmine's voice was not welcome here. As the class continued, the teacher's behavior grew increasingly hostile. She nitpicked every aspect of Jasmine's participation, from the way she held her pen to her posture in her seat. "Sit up straight, Miss King. This isn't some casual hangout spot," Miss Roberts barked, despite the fact that Jasmine's posture was no different from that of her peers. The tension was unbearable. Jasmine's frustration bubbled over, but she took a deep breath and fought to maintain her composure. A small act of resistance, she reminded herself. Just take notes, keep your head down, and endure. The bell rang, signaling the end of class, and as students filed out, Jasmine gathered her things with deliberate calm. She was determined not to give Miss Roberts the satisfaction of seeing her upset, but as she reached the door, Miss Roberts called out to her. "Miss King, a word." Jasmine turned, her expression neutral. "Yes, Miss Roberts." The teacher's smile was thin and sharp. "I hope you understand that in this class, we focus on facts and analysis, not personal opinions or agendas. I'd hate to see you struggle because you can't separate your feelings from the curriculum." Jasmine's breath caught in her throat. With a calmness that belied the storm brewing inside her, she replied, "I understand perfectly, Miss Roberts. I look forward to demonstrating my analysis skills in our next discussion." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Miss Roberts staring after her, a flicker of uncertainty crossing the teacher's face. As Jasmine stepped into the hallway, she felt a mix of relief and anger coursing through her. She was aware that Miss Roberts's prejudices were not just a personal vendetta, but a reflection of a systemic issue within the school. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she had a voice, and it was time to use it. The rising tension. In the days that followed, the atmosphere in Miss Roberts' classroom grew increasingly hostile toward Jasmine. Every lesson felt like a battlefield, with Miss Roberts sharpening her criticism and Jasmine standing firm in her resolve. It was a precarious balance, and Jasmine felt the weight of it pressing down on her with every passing moment. The classroom, once a place of learning, had transformed into a stage for Miss Roberts' cruelty. The other students watched in a mix of horror and morbid fascination as Miss Roberts honed in on Jasmine, nitpicking her contributions and belittling her efforts. Jasmine, however, refused to be silenced. Each day, she entered the classroom with her head held high, determined to face whatever challenges lay ahead. On this particular day, as Jasmine took her seat, she could sense Miss Roberts' focus intensifying. The teacher's gaze was like a spotlight, and the tension in the room was palpable. Miss Roberts began the lesson, her voice dripping with condescension as she announced a group project. "I'll be assigning the groups. We wouldn't want anyone to feel out of place," she said, her tone implying that Jasmine would somehow bring the group down. Jasmine's heart raced as she squared her shoulders, meeting Miss Roberts' gaze with quiet determination. As Miss Roberts called out names for group assignments, Jasmine felt a knot tighten in her stomach. When her name was announced, she was grouped with students who had shown little interest in her. The implications of Miss Roberts' words hung heavy in the air, and Jasmine recognized the challenge for what it was. As the lesson progressed, Miss Roberts seemed to take particular pleasure in scrutinizing Jasmine's every move. "Miss King, is that gum I see you chewing?" she snapped suddenly, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Jasmine froze, her hand halfway to her mouth. "No, Miss Roberts, she began, but the teacher cut her off. "Don't lie to me, young lady. Spit it out this instant." Jasmine stood slowly, her movements deliberate. She walked to the trash can, pantomiming spitting out non-existent gum, and returned to her seat, the silence in the room deafening. Jasmine could feel the stares of her classmates, some sympathetic, others reveling in the humiliation she was enduring. As the class continued, Miss Roberts' tirade intensified. She nitpicked Jasmine's participation and even criticized her handwriting. "You need to present yourself more professionally, Miss King. This is not a casual environment," she barked. Jasmine's fingers curled around her pen, a familiar frustration simmering beneath her calm exterior. But Jasmine refused to back down. She raised her hand again to contribute to the group discussion, but Miss Roberts merely smirked and waved her off. "I'm sorry, Miss King. Perhaps you'd like to take a moment to reflect on your attitude instead." Jasmine's hands clenched into fists beneath her desk. She had entered this class hoping to engage with literature and expand her understanding of the world, but all she faced was ridicule and discrimination. Miss Roberts' comments had stripped the lessons of their value, replacing them with a constant reminder of the teacher's biases. Then, halfway through the lesson, Jasmine saw an opportunity. During a group discussion, she raised her hand again, her voice steady as she addressed the class. "I believe the themes of racial injustice in To Kill a Mockingbird are crucial to understanding the novel. Harper Lee's message is still relevant today." Miss Roberts' lips curled into a cold smile. Yes, the racial themes. How very unique of you, Miss King. But don't you think you're overemphasizing certain aspects? After all, there are broader literary merits to discuss." Jasmine's brow furrowed, but she refused to let her frustration show. "I think the racial issues are central to the story, Miss Roberts. They provide critical context for the character's actions and motivations." Miss Roberts' gaze hardened, and she leaned forward, her voice dripping with disdain. "Perhaps in your previous school, such narrow interpretations were acceptable, but here we expect a higher level of academic rigor." The silence in the room was suffocating. Jasmine could feel the weight of her classmates' gazes, a mix of sympathy and disbelief. She felt as if the walls were closing in on her, but she stood her ground. "I have supported each point with textual evidence and scholarly sources," she asserted, her voice steady. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, Miss Roberts called out, "Miss King, please see me after class. We need to discuss your performance." Jasmine approached the teacher's desk, her heart pounding but her expression carefully neutral. Miss Roberts looked up, her eyes cold. "If you can't adapt to the standards of this class, perhaps you should consider finding a more suitable environment." The weight of the humiliation pressed down on Jasmine, but she refused to let it crush her spirit. "I understand perfectly, Miss Roberts. I'll continue to do my best as I always have," she replied, her voice low but firm. As Jasmine walked out of the classroom, she knew that the upcoming group project presentation would be a pivotal moment. Miss Roberts would use it as an opportunity to humiliate her in front of the entire class, but Jasmine was determined not to give her that satisfaction. She could feel the storm brewing within her, a quiet determination building. The days passed, and Jasmine prepared for the presentation with relentless focus, poring over her notes and ensuring every detail was perfect. She was ready to show Miss Roberts and her classmates that she would not be silenced. The presentation. The day of the group project presentation arrived, and Jasmine stood in front of her classmates, her heart racing with anticipation. She had spent countless hours preparing, meticulously crafting her analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird. The project board behind her displayed a well-researched overview, focusing on the themes of racial injustice and moral courage. As she began her presentation, she could feel Miss Roberts's eyes narrowing, the teacher's gaze a sharp scrutiny, waiting for any misstep. Jasmine took a deep breath, steeling herself against the storm that was sure to come. The other students shifted uneasily in their seats, sensing the tension in the air. Jasmine's voice rang out clear and strong as she articulated her points, her passion shining through. She detailed the importance of understanding the societal issues at play in the novel, highlighting how the story's context resonated with modern society. Halfway through her presentation, Jasmine paused to invite questions. Miss Roberts's hand shot up immediately, and Jasmine steeled herself for the impending confrontation. "Miss King," she drawled, her voice dripping with condescension, "I'm curious about your choice of focus. Don't you think you're overemphasizing certain aspects of the novel? After all, literature is about more than just race." Jasmine felt a mix of indignation and determination surge within her. "I believe the racial themes are central to understanding the book's message, Miss Roberts," she replied, refusing to back down. Harper Lee herself stated that she wrote about the racial injustices of her time. Miss Roberts interrupted again, her voice sharp. "I'm well aware of what the author said, but I'm more interested in why you seem able to appreciate the broader literary merits beyond your personal biases." A collective gasp rippled through the classroom. Jasmine's heart raced, and she clenched her fists at her sides, anger bubbling just beneath the surface. This was not just an academic discussion, it was an attack on her very identity. Jasmine took a deep breath, fighting to maintain her composure. "I don't believe my analysis is biased, Miss Roberts. I've supported each point with textual evidence and scholarly sources." Miss Roberts stood, positioning herself between Jasmine and the rest of the class. Her posture radiated authority as she leaned in closer, her voice rising. "Let me make something clear, Miss King. This constant focus on race is not only misguided but also disruptive to the learning environment. Perhaps in your previous school, such narrow interpretations were acceptable, but here we expect a higher level of academic rigor." The silence in the room was deafening. Jasmine felt her cheeks burn with a mixture of anger and shame, but she refused to let Miss Roberts see her falter. As the teacher continued her tirade, Jasmine gathered her materials, her heart pounding as the weight of humiliation pressed down on her. Then, unexpectedly, a voice piped up from the back of the room. "But I thought Jasmine's presentation was really good, Miss Roberts." The word hung in the air, and Miss Roberts whirled around, her eyes flashing with anger. "And what would you know about literary analysis, Mr. Peterson? Perhaps you'd like to join Miss King in detention to discuss your own academic shortcomings." The student shrank back, effectively silenced, and Jasmine stood frozen by her desk. Miss Roberts turned back to her, the contempt evident in her gaze. "Well, what are you waiting for? Sit down so we can move on to presentations actually worth our time." Jasmine sank into her chair, her face burning as she felt the eyes of her classmates on her. Anger swirled within her, but more than that, a quiet determination began to build. This was not over. As the class continued, Jasmine could hardly focus on the other students' presentations. She was consumed by thoughts of justice and retribution, knowing that the teacher held all the power in that moment. But the storm inside her was brewing, and she knew she would find a way to stand up for herself. After class, as she gathered her things, she couldn't shake the feeling that change was necessary, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been subjected to the same type of prejudice. It was time to reclaim her narrative. The turning point. The tension in Miss Roberts' classroom reached a breaking point when a parent-teacher conference was announced. Jasmine's heart raced at the news. She knew it would be her father, the principal, who would come to defend her. Mr. King was not just an authority figure. He was her advocate, and the thought of him confronting Miss Roberts sent a shiver down her spine. The classroom atmosphere shifted dramatically the following day as the students learned about the conference. Whispers filled the air, and Jasmine could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, a mix of curiosity and concern. She spent the morning fidgeting with her pencil, unsure of what to expect. When the bell rang and students began to file out, Jasmine hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. As she gathered her things, she took a deep breath and steeled herself for whatever might come. Just as Miss Roberts was about to begin her lesson, the classroom door swung open, and Mr. King stepped inside, his tall frame radiating authority. The tension in the room shifted again, this time in Jasmine's favor. The students whispered amongst themselves, their gazes darting between the principal and the teacher. Miss Roberts straightened her posture, plastering a professional smile on her face. "Mr. King, how nice of you to join us," she said, clearly oblivious to the connection between Jasmine and her father. "Thank you, Miss Roberts," he replied, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "I understand you've requested a conference regarding one of your students." Miss Roberts nodded eagerly, launching into her complaints. "I've been quite concerned about Jasmine's performance and attitude in my class. She constantly disrupts the lessons and injects her personal views into discussions. It's unacceptable." Mr. King remained silent, his expression carefully neutral as he allowed her to vent. The class watched in rapt attention, sensing that something momentous was unfolding before them. As Miss Roberts continued her tirade, Mr. King's eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle sign that he was not buying into her narrative. "Can you provide specific examples of Jasmine's disruptions?" he asked, his tone measured. Miss Roberts faltered for a moment, caught off guard by the question. "Well, she argues with other students during discussions, and her body language. It's clear she has no respect for authority." At that moment, the students exchanged incredulous glances. They had witnessed Miss Roberts's behavior and knew the truth. Jasmine had not been the disruptive one. Mr. King took a deep breath, his calm demeanor masking the growing storm beneath the surface. "Miss Roberts, have you considered that what you perceive as defiance might actually be a student engaged in critical thinking?" Miss Roberts blinked, clearly taken aback. I hadn't thought of it that way. But what?" Mr. King pressed, his tone sharp. "You can't dismiss valid interpretations simply because they challenge your worldview." The tension in the room was electric as students leaned in, fully engaged. They had never seen their principal confront a teacher so directly, and it was thrilling. Miss Roberts attempted to regain control of the conversation, her voice rising in defensiveness. "I think Jasmine's previous education must have been lacking. Perhaps a different environment would be more suitable for her." Mr. King's jaw tightened as he held her gaze. "I believe Jasmine's previous education was excellent. I can personally vouch for that." Confusion washed over Miss Roberts's face, and for the first time, she looked uncertain. "I don't understand how you could possibly know that." Mr. King's expression shifted, and the room held its breath. Because I'm Jasmine's father. The realization hit Miss Roberts like a freight train, her expression changing from arrogance to horror as she stammered. You're her father. Yes, Miss Roberts, he replied, his voice firm. And I've been listening very carefully to everything you've said about her. As Miss Roberts stumbled over her words, trying to salvage the situation, Mr. King continued. Your actions have demonstrated a clear bias against my daughter, and your comments suggest a pattern of discrimination that goes beyond a single student. The classroom fell silent, the weight of Mr. King's words settling heavily in the air. Jasmine's heart raced with a mix of relief and vindication. She had longed for someone to stand up for her, to acknowledge the injustices she faced in that classroom. Mr. King addressed the class once more, his voice calm but powerful. Students, education is not about silencing voices or dismissing perspectives that challenge our own. It's about expanding our understanding and learning from diverse experiences. The tension in the room began to shift again, this time toward hope and solidarity. Students exchanged glances, their eyes reflecting a sense of newfound determination. Mr. King turned back to Miss Roberts, who stood frozen in shock. You've created an environment where students feel unsafe expressing their thoughts and experiences. This behavior is unacceptable and will be addressed through the proper channels. As Jasmine watched the exchange, she felt justice served. The news of the upcoming parent-teacher conference spread through the school like wildfire, igniting whispers of speculation and curiosity. It wasn't every day that a principal attended such a meeting, especially regarding his own daughter. The anticipation in the hallways grew heavier with every passing period, and by the time the day ended, Jasmine could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. Everyone was talking about it. As the clock ticked closer to the meeting, Jasmine found herself pacing nervously in the corridor outside her father's office. Despite her composed exterior, a swirl of emotions churned inside her. She knew her father, Mr. King, had always been a strong advocate for her, but the thought of confronting Miss Roberts directly left a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Would the truth finally come out? Or would Miss Roberts, with her years of experience and authority, find a way to twist the narrative to her advantage? The door to her father's office creaked open, and he stepped out, his face calm, but his eyes betraying a flicker of the tension that he rarely let show. Jasmine stopped pacing and turned to face him. The hallway was empty now, the echo of students' footsteps long gone. You ready? He asked softly, his deep voice filled with warmth and reassurance. Jasmine nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure she was. She had spent weeks enduring Miss Roberts's thinly veiled disdain, each encounter chipping away at her resolve, making her question whether anyone else would believe what was happening. But now, standing beside her father, she felt a renewed sense of determination. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about exposing the system of prejudice that had been allowed to fester unchecked. Together, they walked down the hallway toward the conference room, their footsteps echoing off the walls. The air felt thick with the unspoken tension of what was about to unfold. As they approached the door, Jasmine noticed that her palms were sweaty, and she wiped them against her jeans, taking a deep breath to steady herself. Mr. King reached out, gently squeezing her shoulder before opening the door. Inside, Miss Roberts was already seated, her back straight, her hands clasped in front of her, as if she were preparing for a performance. She glanced up as they entered, her face carefully composed, but Jasmine caught the flicker of surprise that passed through her eyes. It was clear Miss Roberts hadn't expected to see her student walk in alongside the principal. "Good afternoon, Mr. King," Miss Roberts said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you for meeting with me. I've been looking forward to discussing Jasmine's progress." Her tone was polite, but the underlying condescension was unmistakable. Jasmine felt her chest tighten with frustration. She had been bracing herself for this moment, but hearing Miss Roberts speak about her as if she were a problem to be fixed sent a surge of anger through her. This wasn't just about academics, and they both knew it. Mr. King, ever the professional, offered a nod as he took a seat across from Miss Roberts. Jasmine sat beside him, her fingers twisting together in her lap as she worked to keep her expression neutral. She didn't want Miss Roberts to see just how much her words affected her. "So," Mr. King began, his voice measured, "you've raised concerns about Jasmine's performance in your class. I'm here to listen to your perspective, but I'd also like to make sure we address any underlying issues that might be contributing to the situation." Miss Roberts's smile tightened, and she nodded, flipping through a few papers on the table in front of her. "Yes, of course. Jasmine is a bright student, but I've noticed some troubling behaviors that I believe are hindering her academic growth. She has a tendency to insert personal views into class discussions that derail the lessons. For instance, during our recent discussion of To Kill a Mockingbird, she seemed fixated on racial themes that, while important, overshadowed the broader literary merits of the novel." Jasmine's pulse quickened as Miss Roberts spoke, her words carrying the same dismissive tone she had used in class. The frustration she had been holding back for weeks threatened to spill over, but she stayed silent, letting her father take the lead. Mr. King's expression remained unreadable, though Jasmine knew him well enough to sense the subtle shift in his posture, an indication that he was carefully weighing every word. "I see," he said slowly, his tone calm but firm. "It sounds like you're suggesting Jasmine's interpretation of the novel wasn't aligned with your expectations. But isn't the purpose of literature, particularly a novel like To Kill a Mockingbird, to encourage students to engage with complex social issues, including race?" Miss Roberts's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she regained her composure. "Of course, Mr. King. But I believe it's important for students to focus on the author's intent rather than imposing their own modern political agendas onto the text. I've noticed that Jasmine has a tendency to emphasize certain aspects that distract from the literary analysis." Jasmine felt her stomach churn. There it was again, that veiled accusation, that her perspective was somehow less valid, that her voice didn't belong in the conversation. "And what do you mean by modern political agendas?" Mr. King asked, his gaze unwavering. Miss Roberts hesitated, clearly realizing that she had to tread carefully. "I simply mean that we should be careful not to let current events or personal biases overshadow the timeless themes of the literature we study." Jasmine clenched her fists under the table, biting back the retort that was burning on her tongue. How many times had Miss Roberts dismissed her points in class, belittling her contributions and implying that her lived experience as a black student was irrelevant to the conversation? Her father leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but carrying an edge that Jasmine recognized as his no-nonsense tone. "I'm concerned about something you said earlier, Miss Roberts. You mentioned that Jasmine's focus on racial themes was distracting. But isn't To Kill a Mockingbird fundamentally a story about racial injustice? How could that be considered a distraction?" Miss Roberts blinked, clearly caught off guard by the directness of the question. "Well, yes, but—" "No," Mr. King interrupted, his tone growing more assertive. "What concerns me is that you seem to be dismissing an important aspect of the novel's message. And more importantly, I'm concerned about how you've treated my daughter in your class. Jasmine has shared with me that she feels consistently singled out and disrespected. Can you explain that?" For the first time, Miss Roberts's composed facade cracked. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands fidgeting with the papers in front of her. I don't believe I've treated Jasmine any differently than any other student," she said, though her voice lacked its previous confidence. Jasmine glanced at her father, grateful for his calm, unwavering support. But she knew this was her moment, too. She couldn't rely on him to fight this battle alone. Taking a deep breath, she spoke up, her voice steady despite the tremor of nerves running through her. "With all due respect, Miss Roberts, that's not how it feels to me," Jasmine said, her eyes locking onto her teacher's. "I've raised my hand in class multiple times to contribute, and you've either ignored me or shut me down. When I've tried to talk about the racial themes in the novel, you've dismissed my points as biased or political. But those themes are important, and they're a big part of why Harper Lee wrote the book. It feels like my voice doesn't matter in your classroom." Miss Roberts's face flushed, and for a moment, she seemed at a loss for words. Jasmine could see the gears turning in her head as she scrambled to regain control of the situation. "I never meant to make you feel that way, Jasmine," Miss Roberts said finally, though her tone still carried a trace of defensiveness. "But it's important for students to stay focused on the curriculum." Mr. King's voice cut through the tension, sharp and clear. "Miss Roberts, my concern is that Jasmine's contributions aren't being valued in your classroom. It's one thing to guide students toward deeper analysis. It's another to dismiss their perspectives outright, especially when those perspectives are integral to understanding the material. And from what I've heard, it seems that Jasmine isn't the only student who has felt marginalized in your class." Miss Roberts's eyes widened in surprise. She clearly hadn't expected the conversation to take this turn. Jasmine could see the wheels spinning in her mind as she tried to salvage the situation. But it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Mr. King leaned back in his chair, his gaze never leaving Miss Roberts. "I think it's clear that this issue goes beyond Jasmine's performance in your class. There's a larger problem at play here, and it needs to be addressed. We'll be taking steps to ensure that all students feel respected and valued in this school, starting with a review of the way your classroom is being managed." Miss Roberts opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. She seemed to realize that she had lost control of the situation entirely. Jasmine's heart pounded in her chest as she listened to her father speak. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when her voice, and the voices of others like hers, would finally be heard. "Thank you for your time, Miss Roberts," Mr. King said, rising from his seat. "We'll be in touch." With that, he gestured for Jasmine to follow him, and together they walked out of the conference room, leaving Miss Roberts sitting in stunned silence. As they stepped into the hallway, Jasmine felt a sense of relief wash over her. The weight that had been pressing down on her for weeks seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet but powerful sense of triumph. She had spoken up. She had stood her ground. And now, things were finally going to change. The following morning, Westfield High was abuzz with whispers and rumors about what had transpired during the parent-teacher conference. Word had spread quickly, and by the time Jasmine arrived at school, it seemed that everyone was talking about it. As she walked through the hallways, students who had once avoided her now offered friendly smiles or nods of acknowledgement. She could hear snippets of conversations about how things were finally going to change, about how the administration was cracking down on teachers who exhibited biased behavior, and about the new diversity workshops that were being planned. Jasmine felt a surge of pride as she realized the impact her actions had made. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every student who had ever felt silenced or marginalized. It was about creating an environment where all voices could be heard. Later that day, as she sat in her English classroom, now temporarily led by a substitute teacher, Jasmine felt the weight of the past few weeks slowly begin to fade away. The tension that had once filled the room was gone, replaced by a sense of openness and mutual respect. The lesson continued without incident, and for the first time in weeks, Jasmine found herself actually enjoying the discussion. She raised her hand, contributing her thoughts without fear of being dismissed or ridiculed. And when she finished speaking, her classmates nodded in agreement, validating her perspective in a way that felt deeply empowering. After class, Jasmine was approached by several students who expressed their support for what she had done. They talked about how they, too, had noticed Miss Roberts's unfair treatment, but had been too afraid to speak up. Now they felt emboldened to stand up for what was right. As Jasmine walked through the school halls that day, she felt a sense of peace and pride wash over her. She had taken a stand, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced by prejudice. And in doing so, she had sparked a change that would reverberate throughout Westfield High for years to come. A new beginning. The crisp autumn air carried a sense of renewal through the halls of Westfield High, a stark contrast to the heavy tension that had hung over the school just days before. Jasmine King walked through the entrance with her head held high, the soft echo of her footsteps in tune with the whispers of change reverberating throughout the building. It was still early in the morning, and the school had just begun to come alive with the chatter of students and the faint squeak of sneakers on polished floors. Jasmine paused for a moment, taking in the atmosphere that felt distinctly different from the one she had grown used to. The hallways, once filled with nervous glances and hushed conversations whenever she walked by, now greeted her with nods, smiles, and quiet acknowledgments. Some of her peers even greeted her by name, a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes about the shift that had taken place. It had been 3 days since the confrontation with Miss Roberts and her father's intervention. In that short time, Jasmine had seen more change than she ever thought possible. Miss Roberts had been placed on an indefinite leave pending an internal investigation, and whispers of her dismissal buzzed among both students and teachers. Meanwhile, Jasmine's father, Mr. King, had taken swift action, organizing a series of meetings with staff and students to address concerns about the school's climate. These discussions laid the groundwork for what would become a transformative period at Westfield High, one that went beyond any single classroom. As Jasmine passed by the teacher's lounge, she caught sight of a group of teachers engaged in quiet conversation. They stopped talking for a moment when they noticed her and gave her a collective nod of acknowledgement. Jasmine nodded back, her mind replaying the countless times she'd been dismissed or overlooked by some of these same teachers. But now, things were different. The subtle shift in their attitudes was undeniable. She turned the corner toward her locker, and there was Sarah, the shy girl from her English class, who had been one of the few to speak up in her defense. Sarah was waiting for her, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Jasmine smiled back, grateful for the friendship that had blossomed between them in the aftermath of everything. "Hey, Jasmine," Sarah said as she approached, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I was just waiting to see if you were coming. Have you heard? There's going to be a school-wide assembly next week to talk about the new diversity initiatives. I heard your dad's going to speak." Jasmine nodded, the familiar sense of pride welling up inside her when she thought about her father's role in all of this. "Yeah, he mentioned it last night. They're starting with workshops for teachers, and then they're going to have student-led discussions. It's supposed to be a long-term thing, not just a one-time event." Sarah's eyes lit up with excitement. "That's amazing. I've never seen anything like this happen before. I mean, it's about time, right? I'm just glad people are finally listening." Jasmine smiled, feeling the warmth of Sarah's words settle over her like a comforting blanket. She could feel the ripples of change all around her, not just in the policies that were being put into place, but in the attitudes of her peers and teachers alike. For so long, she had felt isolated, like her voice didn't matter. But now things were different. As they walked together toward their first class of the day, a group of students caught up to them. Among them was Kyle, the boy who had defended Jasmine during her presentation. He offered her a nod, his face serious but kind. "Jasmine," he said, "I just wanted to say thanks again for what you did. You've changed things here. I think a lot of us have been too scared to speak up about what's been going on, but after seeing you stand your ground, it's given the rest of us the courage to do the same." Jasmine felt a lump form in her throat, and for a moment, she didn't know how to respond. It was still surreal to her, the idea that she had sparked something much bigger than herself. She had been so focused on simply surviving Miss Roberts' class, on making it through each day without being broken by the weight of the teacher's prejudice, that she hadn't fully grasped the broader impact her actions were having. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "But it wasn't just me. It's all of us. We all have a part to play in making sure this kind of thing doesn't happen again." Kyle nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. We're with you." They continued walking together, the group of students growing larger as more people joined in, their conversation swirling around the changes that were happening at Westfield. It was a small but significant shift. People coming together, openly talking about issues that had been swept under the rug for far too long. Jasmine couldn't help but feel a swell of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something lasting. A different classroom. Jasmine's first class that morning was English, the same class that had once been a source of dread for her. But today, things were different. With Miss Roberts on leave, the school had brought in a temporary substitute, Mrs. Landry, a warm, soft-spoken woman with kind eyes and a genuine passion for literature. Jasmine had met her briefly the day before, and while she hadn't had time to form a full opinion, there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. As she entered the classroom, Jasmine noticed that the usual undercurrent of tension was gone. Students who had once kept their heads down, afraid of drawing Miss Roberts's ire, now seemed relaxed, chatting quietly as they settled into their seats. The classroom itself felt lighter, as though a dark cloud had finally lifted. Mrs. Landry stood at the front of the room, a welcoming smile on her face. She greeted each student as they entered, calling them by name and asking how they were doing. It was a small thing, but it made a world of difference. "Good morning, Jasmine," Mrs. Landry said as Jasmine took her seat. "I'm glad to see you today. We're going to have a really interesting discussion about To Kill a Mockingbird. I'd love to hear your thoughts when we get started." Jasmine nodded, her heart lifting at the teacher's sincerity. For the first time in a long time, she felt like her voice would be welcomed, not silenced. The class began, and as Mrs. Landry led them through a discussion of the novel's themes, Jasmine raised her hand. This time, instead of being ignored or dismissed, she was called on immediately. "I think one of the most important aspects of the book is how it shows the way systemic racism affects not just individuals, but entire communities," Jasmine said, her voice steady and clear. Atticus Finch's fight for justice in the courtroom is a reflection of the larger struggle for equality in society. It's about more than just one man's guilt or innocence. It's about how society is structured to keep certain people in positions of power while oppressing others. Mrs. Landry nodded thoughtfully. "That's an excellent point, Jasmine. Harper Lee was definitely highlighting those larger societal issues through the characters' experiences. I think it's important that we explore how those same themes resonate today." Mrs. Landry continued, her voice warm and encouraging. "Who else has thoughts on how the novel's messages about justice and inequality are still relevant in our society?" A few more hands went up, and Jasmine felt a wave of relief. She wasn't alone in this anymore. The conversation that followed was thoughtful, respectful, and, for the first time in a long while, inclusive. Every student had a voice, and Mrs. Landry was careful to make sure that no one was dismissed or belittled. As the discussion moved forward, Jasmine found herself more engaged than she had been in weeks. She contributed freely, knowing that her ideas were being valued for what they were, a valid interpretation of the text. Her classmates chimed in too, with Sarah and Kyle offering their thoughts on how literature like To Kill a Mockingbird should challenge readers to reflect on their own roles in fighting injustice. By the time the bell rang, signaling the end of class, the room was buzzing with energy. Jasmine felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her chest. The shift in the classroom dynamic was undeniable. What had once been a hostile environment was now a space where she could finally learn, grow, and share her perspective without fear of ridicule. As she gathered her things, Mrs. Landry caught her eye. "Jasmine, could I speak with you for a moment before you head out?" Jasmine nodded, walking to the front of the classroom as her classmates filed out. Mrs. Landry waited until the room was mostly empty before speaking. "I just wanted to say how much I appreciated your contributions today," Mrs. Landry said, her expression genuine. "Your insights really added depth to our discussion, and I can see that you've put a lot of thought into the novel. I know the last few weeks have been difficult, but I want you to know that I'm here to support you in any way I can." Jasmine blinked, feeling the surge of gratitude. After weeks of being silenced and belittled, it was a strange but welcome feeling to be supported by a teacher. "Thank you, Mrs. Landry," Jasmine said quietly. It means a lot. I've been through a lot in this class." Mrs. Landry's expression softened with understanding. "I've heard about what happened, and I want to assure you that things are going to be different moving forward. I'm committed to creating an environment where every student feels heard and respected." Jasmine smiled, a sense of relief washing over her. "I really appreciate that." With a final nod, Jasmine left the classroom, feeling like the burden she'd been carrying for so long had finally begun to lift. The ripple effect. Over the next few days, Jasmine saw the changes at Westfield High unfold with surprising speed. The administration, led by her father, had moved swiftly to address the concerns raised by students and teachers alike. Diversity workshops were scheduled for staff, with the goal of fostering greater awareness and sensitivity to the issues that had been long ignored. Student-led discussions were also in the works, and Jasmine had been invited to help lead one of them. It was during lunch that Jasmine and Sarah, sitting together under a tree in the school courtyard, began to brainstorm ideas for their session. Sarah had grown more confident since the confrontation with Miss Roberts, and Jasmine had noticed a new spark in her friend, one that was driven by a shared desire to create real, lasting change. "I was thinking," Sarah said, pulling out a notebook and flipping to a blank page, "that maybe we could start by talking about what it means to be an ally. You know, like how important it is for people to speak up when they see something wrong, even if they're not the ones directly affected." Jasmine nodded, scribbling down some notes of her own. "Yeah, that's definitely important. I think a lot of people don't realize how much their silence contributes to the problem. It's like, even if they're not the ones saying something hurtful, if they just sit by and watch it happen, they're still part of the problem." Sarah tapped her pen against her chin, deep in thought. "Exactly. I mean, look at what happened in our English class. So many people saw what was going on, but it wasn't until you spoke up that things started to change. If more people had spoken out earlier, maybe things wouldn't have gotten so bad." Jasmine sighed, remembering the weeks of isolation and frustration she had endured. But now, sitting here with Sarah, she felt hopeful. Things were changing, and the conversations they were having felt meaningful. "I think we should also talk about the importance of understanding different perspectives," Jasmine added. "Like, people need to realize that their experiences aren't universal. Just because they haven't faced discrimination doesn't mean it doesn't exist." Sarah nodded enthusiastically, jotting down more notes. "Yes, and we can include examples from literature to show how these themes come up in stories we've all read. I mean, To Kill a Mockingbird is a perfect example. If we look at it from different angles, we can see how racism, classism, and power dynamics are woven into the fabric of the story." As they continued to brainstorm, other students joined them, eager to be part of the conversation. It wasn't long before a small group had gathered under the tree, each contributing ideas for how they could make their school more inclusive and supportive for everyone. It was a far cry from the Westfield High that Jasmine had known just weeks before. Kyle, who had quietly listened for most of the conversation, finally spoke up. "I think we also need to talk about accountability. It's one thing to have discussions and workshops, but if people aren't held accountable for their actions, nothing will really change." Jasmine nodded in agreement. "You're right. And that goes for both students and teachers. If someone says or does something harmful, they need to face consequences. It's not enough to just talk about these issues. We need to take action." The group murmured in agreement, and Jasmine felt a swell of pride as she looked around at the faces of her peers. This was the change she had been fighting for, an open, honest dialogue about the issues that mattered. And more importantly, it was a conversation that would lead to real action. The assembly. The following week, the entire school gathered for the much-anticipated Assembly on Diversity and Inclusion. The gymnasium buzzed with energy as students filed in, eager to hear what the administration had planned. Jasmine sat near the front, alongside Sarah and Kyle, her heart pounding with a mixture of nerves and excitement. Today would be the culmination of everything she had fought for, the moment when the school officially acknowledged the need for change. Mr. King stood at the podium, his commanding presence drawing the attention of every student and teacher in the room. He began by addressing the events that had led to the assembly, the confrontation with Miss Roberts, and the broader issues of bias and prejudice that had been brought to light. As many of you know, our school has recently been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths. Mr. King said, his voice steady but firm. The treatment of one of our students, my daughter, Jasmine, was unacceptable. But this isn't just about one teacher or one classroom. This is about the culture of our school and the need for all of us to take responsibility for creating a safe, inclusive environment. Jasmine felt a lump form in her throat as she listened to her father speak. He wasn't just talking about her. He was talking about everyone who had ever been marginalized or silenced at Westfield High. This was bigger than any one incident. This was about creating lasting change. We are committed to making sure that every student feels heard and respected, Mr. King continued. That's why, starting today, we are implementing a series of initiatives designed to promote diversity, inclusion, and accountability. This will include mandatory training for all staff, student-led discussions, and a review of our curriculum to ensure that it reflects the diversity of our student body. The crowd murmured in approval, and Jasmine felt a surge of pride as she realized just how far they had come. And now, Mr. King said, turning to the audience with a smile, I'd like to introduce a student who has shown incredible courage in the face of adversity, someone who has been a catalyst for the change we are about to embark on. Please join me in welcoming Jasmine King. Jasmine's heart leaped into her throat as the crowd erupted into applause. She hadn't expected this. Her father had mentioned that she might have a role in the assembly, but she hadn't realized she would be asked to speak. With trembling hands, Jasmine stood and made her way to the podium. The applause continued as she took her place in front of the microphone, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced out at the sea of faces, her classmates, her teachers, her father, all of them looking at her with encouragement and support. Taking a deep breath, Jasmine began to speak. I never thought I'd be standing here today, she said, her voice steady despite the nerves. A few weeks ago, I felt like my voice didn't matter. I felt invisible. But today, I stand here knowing that my voice, and the voices of every student in this school, does matter. The crowd was silent, hanging on her every word. What happened to me in that classroom wasn't just about one teacher's prejudice, Jasmine continued. It was about a system that allows that kind of behavior to go unchecked. But we have the power to change that. We have the power to make sure that every student, no matter their race, background, or identity, feels safe and respected here. Jasmine's voice grew stronger as she spoke, her confidence building with each word. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without effort. But if we all commit to doing the work, if we speak up when we see something wrong, if we listen to each other, and if we hold each other accountable, we can create a school where everyone feels like they belong. The applause that followed was deafening. Jasmine stepped back from the podium, her heart full as she looked out at the crowd. This was more than just a victory for her. It was a victory for everyone who had ever felt silenced, marginalized, or dismissed. As she left the stage, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. The fight wasn't over, but it was just beginning. And now, for the first time, Jasmine knew she wasn't fighting alone. The days that followed the assembly were filled with action and progress. The diversity workshops began in earnest, and students were invited to share their experiences and ideas for improving the school's culture. Jasmine, along with Sarah and Kyle, played an active role in these discussions, helping to shape the future of Westfield High. Teachers, too, were held accountable. The administration made it clear that there would be zero tolerance for any form of bias or discrimination, and Miss Roberts' absence was a reminder that no one was above the school's commitment to fairness and inclusion. For Jasmine, life at Westfield High was different now. She was no longer the quiet, invisible student in the back of the class. She had found her voice, and with it, she had helped ignite a movement that would reshape her school for years to come. As she walked through the hallways one afternoon, She passed by a bulletin board filled with posters for upcoming diversity events, student clubs, and mentorship programs. She smiled to herself, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. This was the change she had dreamed of, a school where every student felt valued and heard. The journey had been long and difficult, but in the end, Jasmine knew it had been worth it. She had stood up against injustice, and in doing so, she had helped pave the way for a new beginning, not just for herself, but for everyone at Westfield High. And as she looked ahead to the future, Jasmine knew that this was only the beginning.